Agni is regarded as a personality, as that element, but also that being who is able to release awareness and energy and heat and light from where it is being trapped in the earth and earth and water elements, and to release it into the less physical aspects of reality.
Welcome to Living with Reality, a podcast featuring archived teachings and modern conversations with Dr. Robert Svoboda, brought to you by the Be Here Now Network. Living with Reality explores Ayurveda and other wisdom traditions of India, which Dr. Svoboda has been studying for nearly 50 years. For more information, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Dr. Svoboda. That's DRSVOBODA. Hello, and welcome to Living with Reality. I'm Paula Crossfield, your host, and Dr. Svoboda's media collaborator, who helped him build his business online. I'm so excited to bring you an interview I did with him on my podcast, the Cosmic Business Podcast, all about fire, and specifically Bhuta Agni. This is our mental fire that digests the things in our world. And he talks about how we can improve that mental fire and so much more. So I hope you enjoy this interview. And if you'd like to study with Dr. Svoboda, you can go to drsvoboda.teachable.com. That's DRSVOBODA.teachable.com/courses. And you'll see all of Dr. Svoboda's courses on so many topics, including one on Bhuta Agni and other topics in Ayurveda. So I hope you'll check it out. And meanwhile, enjoy the interview. Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm so grateful that you're here. If you're new here, welcome. I'm really thrilled to be sharing a conversation with my mentor and friend, Dr. Robert Svoboda, today, who is the first Westerner ever to graduate from a college of Ayurveda and be licensed to practice Ayurveda in India. During and after his formal Ayurvedic training, he was tutored in Ayurveda, yoga, Jyotish, Tantra, and other forms of classical Indian lore by his mentor, the Aghori Vimalananda. He is the author of over a dozen books and has served as an adjunct faculty at the Ayurvedic Institute in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and at Bastyr University in Kenmore, Washington. And you can find out more about his work and study online with him at Dr. Svoboda, DRSVOBODA.com, and follow him on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Of course, if you've been following me for a while, you know that I helped build his online business, and we actually run his business. He has a lot of incredible courses. I've learned so much from him. And of course, we've also had other conversations on the podcast with him about karma, money, Saturn, ancestors, and so many more conversations. So if you would like to check those out, we will put links in the show notes to those earlier conversations. And in the first conversation we had, we actually talked about his story. So if you want to learn more about how he journeyed to India and got to meet his mentor and learn all about the Indian sciences, you can definitely check that out. Our topic for today is the element of fire and how fire is useful for us as business owners and living individuals as a form of transformation, as a way to clarify things, work with our mind, digest ideas, be able to produce things. We talk a lot about all of these different things here, and he gives a Vedic perspective on fire and an Ayurvedic perspective on fire as an Ayurvedic physician. So I hope this episode is interesting to you. I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions, I'm going to be doing an Ask Me Anything episode very soon. So if you would like to ask me any questions about astrology, business strategy, or anything you want to know, I'm happy to answer your questions. And you can just send me an email to paula@weaveyourbliss.com and make sure you put the subject line AMA so that I know that it is about that topic. And I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Svoboda and I in conversation. We did this live in LA recently, and so you may hear some street noise and hopefully the sound is good. We did use a different setup than we normally do. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Robert Svoboda. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. I have a very special guest who I know that all of you love hearing from, and that's Dr. Robert Svoboda. So for those of you who don't know Dr. Svoboda, he is the first Westerner to graduate from a school of Ayurveda and be licensed to practice Ayurveda in India. He also is the author of 12 books and just such a wealth of knowledge on the Vedic sciences. And we're here today to talk about fire, which is an incredibly powerful subject that he has spoken about at length. So first of all, maybe just tell us why working with fire is so important in the Vedic sciences as a whole.
Well, I think the best place to begin is the fact that fire is the thing that has made humans what we are today. So far as we know, we're the only species thus far that has been able to harness fire, to be able to use it in a controlled way. And we've been doing that. Apparently, the first time people started experimenting with that was maybe 1.5 million years ago, well before our species existed, back in the time of Homo erectus. So it's been a long period of humans getting comfortable with working with fire. Fire is noteworthy for us because it has provided us with many things that we did not have before. Number one thing for us is the ability to see at night. And we're diurnal creatures. We work during the day and we need to find a place to be safe during the night. And when you have a fire, other animals are discouraged from coming near you. You're able to stay warmer. You're able to see what's around you. You're able to provide a degree of protection that we never had before then, number one. Number two, it expanded dramatically the type of and number of species that we could eat. There are many things that you simply can't consume raw, but you can definitely consume cooked. And there are many things that you can consume cooked that you will get a lot more nutrition out of than if you consume them raw. So it made it a lot easier for us to be able to obtain calories. And it's quite possible that that facilitated us developing bigger brains and bigger nervous systems, because our brains, after all, do take 20 or 25% of the energy that we take in from our food. Fire also took a lot of the foods that we eat, and by virtue of having them be cooked, made them less filled with bacteria and viruses and other infective things. And so it made it easier for us to survive the food that we were consuming. But possibly even more important for us and the way that we've developed, humans are extremely visual. In fact, we have some of the best visual resolution of anybody in the animal kingdom. But fire is something that, of course, is very fascinating and kind of hypnotic to look at. And as people started working with fire, they, back then, of course, were very different than you and me. They were not so externalized. We have lots of things that draw our attention outward. Back then, there were plenty of things to draw your attention outward. You didn't want to be eaten by the saber-toothed tiger. You didn't want to fall off the cliff. But most of the time, you were focusing on what was going on the inside, because that's where you were experiencing what was coming in from the outside. And fire entered into a conversation with us. It was a conversation that exposed us as organisms to the concept. And, you know, conceptualization is one of the things that really substantially distinguishes us from other organisms. We can take things that are literal and make them symbolic. And so the fire is a very interesting thing. Fire never existed on Earth until less than 500 million years ago. And fire was not at all widespread on Earth until about 7 million years ago, which was about the time that primates started developing in Africa. So in a way, we and fire have co-evolved. Fire only became widespread when there were the open savannas where there were grasses so that the fire could propagate easily. And we started developing in those open savannas also. And what is fire after all? It's the energy of the sun that has been trapped in matter and is being released. And fortunately for us, we have the right amount of oxygen in our atmosphere. Earlier, there was no fire because there was not enough oxygen. And then there was a period where things would spontaneously combust because there was too much oxygen. But we've reached a stable 21%, and this 21% is the nice sweet spot where we can generate fire but not worry that our bouquet is going to suddenly burst into flames for no apparent reason other than it can. The sunlight is trapped in matter, and the fire releases it again. This is something we, modern people, this is not a strange concept. This very understanding of how the sun could provide energy that could remain for years and years and years, and then have that energy released again, is something that must have been tremendously revolutionary to our distant ancestors. And something that I believe encouraged them to start trying to understand, to look at the question of how the remainder of the environment could be stable, but fire was something that had to be brought to life, had to be kept alive, and that eventually would die out, just like animals and plants and other things. There was, at some point, an awareness that was created of that similarity between fire and human beings, and the fact that we human beings are similar to fires in that way. We also have energy that has been trapped in our organisms, and we're slowly working through that energy, and at some point we'll burn out whatever energy we have available to us that is keeping us moving forward, and then we will go back to the elements we came from. But during that period that we have active fire within us, that's the time that we are actively interacting with the environment. We're actively changing ourselves and our environment. We're actively co-creating our world with that fire.
It's interesting though, because we like all the elements. There's 5 of them, right?
We love all the elements.
They all have different roles. They're all within us. They're all without us. They're all around us, right? But this particular element is the first word of the Veda, right? So why did it get so associated with the Vedic sciences, and how is it particular to that spiritual tradition?
There are 5 elements, and those elements are akasha, or space. And that's really the basis of all this, because if there was no space, there would not be any place in which things could be put. And inside the space, there is air. And air is also extremely basic because air provides movement. If there was no movement, everything would be static and we would be stuck. Nothing would be happening. And air inspires the fire. So, and we see that if you've ever built a fire, you have to have, the fuel has to be arranged in such a way that the air can move through it and keep generating, keep encouraging the fire to be generated and released. As the fire cools down, it turns into water, and then as it cools further, it becomes really, really solidified, just like the vase here. Fire is the balance point, the fulcrum between the 2 relatively less physical things, space, and in the Vedic perspective on things, space is matter. it's not something, it's not the absence of things. It is something that is actual physical matter. And it's just that space is much less dense than Earth is. Earth and water are much more dense, space and air are much less dense. Fire is in between the two. And that's really how fire is described in the Veda. In fact, the first portion of the first verse of the first hymn of the first Veda is Agnim Ile Purohitam. Agni is the priest.
Agni meaning fire.
Agni meaning fire. And we have that word Agni, or a very similar word in English, in the word ignite. Agni, the Indo-European root. So Agni means fire, and Purohita is a priest, one who offers from us humans, or down here on the physical world, and we're offering to the non-physical world, to all the beings that live in the non-physical world. So it's very much a transition from the denser parts of reality into the less dense parts of reality. Agni is regarded as a personality, as that element, but also that being who is able to release awareness and energy and heat and light from where it is being trapped in the earth and earth and water elements, and to release it into the less physical aspects of reality. And so the Vedas understood, or the great rishis who developed the Vedas understood, that there was a reality that was much more fundamental than the reality of the manifested physical world and the life that's in it. And that reality is something that is of a different nature, but also has the capability of interacting with the reality that we have. And they discovered that, in fact, people are animals and people and plants and so on. They're coming into manifestation in this world, then they're leaving this world, and then they're coming back into manifestation in this world. So in the same way that we as individuals are being manifested, or we're getting tangled up in matter, and then we're getting released from the matter, the fire is already tangled up in the matter and simply has to be released from the matter. And then there was an understanding. Not only was there a symbolism between these two things, but there was an actual reality that we could establish a relationship with. And therefore, the rishis, the seers of the Veda, entered onto a path where they started to create a relationship. And over thousands of years, this relationship has been cultivated and improved. And now anyone who is attentive and serious about developing a relationship with fire in that way can do so, because of those experiments that were done in the far past.
So one word that comes to mind, which I don't think I heard you say, is transformation. Like, that's really the key, is that it gives this opportunity to transform. So whatever we are into whatever we want to be, by working with the fire. And one particular lens on that is through the lens of Ayurveda, using digestion as an example. So maybe you can talk about what is Agni actually? What are the types of Agni, like according to Ayurveda, that we need to be aware of?
The reason that we use the concept of Agni in Ayurveda is that externally we see that matter is being transformed into energy. Matter, the energy that is actually tied up in the matter, is getting released. Some of the matter is remaining. Some of it is going in other directions. But some is the energy that was holding that matter together in a particular configuration is being released as that configuration is released. And as far as human beings are concerned, whatever we take in as food is being broken down, just like whatever goes into a fire is being broken down. and it's being converted into something that is much more refined than was the original material that was made up the food that we ate. After it was converted into something that was more refined, it again went into nourishing the parts of our organism that need to be nourished in order for us to continue to live and function as living beings. So it's simple enough to envision the fact that in the same way that you put something into an external fire, you could put something into an internal fire and that it would be burned up. It's a little more of a challenge to see that we can see that being burned up turns into us, turns into something new. We're killing things all the time in order to be able to stay alive ourselves. We're destroying order in order to generate order. The second law of thermodynamics says that things in our universe are always proceeding in the direction of becoming less orderly. As organisms, as when we grow from being a zygote to being trillions of cells, we are becoming more orderly, but we're destroying more order in the form of the food that we're destroying in order to gain the order that we have. So it's all about, in the same way with when you're working with the fire, something that's orderly, like a grape. You put it into the fire. It has generated, it has grown. The life force prana has caused it to take sunlight and carbon dioxide from the air and minerals from the soil and water, and it has turned into a grape. And we put it into the fire, and everything that had condensed into the grape now releases into something else. It's not as easy for us to see what it's being released into as we can see what happens to us when we eat a grape, though we can't immediately identify specifically what that grape is going to do to us. We know by virtue of plenty of experience that if you eat enough grapes for a long enough time, you will be able to remain alive, even if you have nothing to eat but grapes. So the concept of there being a fire in the gut, and this fire behaving just like the external fire, and sending things into the other world, just like the external fire. And the context of the physical or of the organism, the other world includes not just the physical body, but also which we sometimes call the annamaya kosha, the sheath, the covering of our awareness that is made out of food. But it also goes into and nourishes the pranamaya kosha, which is the sheath that is made up of the life force. And it nourishes the manomaya kosha, the sheath that is made up of the thoughts and emotions and mental processes that we possess. So in that way, it is very similar to what the fire is doing. The fire is connecting us to a more subtle world. It's happening on the inside also. So in Ayurveda, we call this the Bhuta Agni. Bhuta basically means the gut. It's a very old Sanskrit word. So the Bhuta Agni is the part of the Agni that is working mainly with the physical body. But because we don't live in a purely mechanistic universe, because there is something more than just the material reality, there is fire that exists on all levels of the organism, because the fire needs to be transforming things everywhere in the organism. And even in the physical body, yes, there is fire in your gut, but there is fire in other parts of your organism also. There is fire, for example, in your skin. And one of the things that the fire in your skin does is that it facilitates the change of the oil in your skin, the transformation of that oil into vitamin D. And there is fire in your eyes. And one of the things that does is facilitate the transformation of photons into electrical impulses, into patterns of activity that can then be cognized as what we call vision. Transformation of all varieties in your organism is under the control of fire. So my mentor, Vimalananda, liked to draw a distinction between the Jatra Agni and the Bhuta Agni. Now, the word Bhuta Agni is the word Bhuta can mean enough things that different people will be meaning different things by when they use the word Bhuta Agni. So when Vimalananda used the word Bhuta Agni, he was talking about the form of Agni that is much closer to its existence as a Mahabhuta, an element, than is the Jatra Agni. Because the Jatra Agni, yes, it is fire, but you will not find any open flame in your body, we hope. What you will find is there are pancreatic enzymes, and there is bile, and there is stomach acid, and all of these things together, some of them are very hot. Acid will burn. Acid is pH 2 in your stomach. If you get it on your skin, you would burn yourself. So it is hot. It is not hot in the way that an open flame is. It's still delivering heat. It's still delivering something that is required to perform the activity that the external flame does. But it's manifesting in that way very much through the very complicated flesh that has been evolved over so many billions of years to facilitate awareness being projected through an organism like this. Whereas the Bhuta Agni is something that does not require such a complex material matrix in order to project itself into. It's something that's much closer to the elemental fire, and we often in English translate the word Mahabhuta as an element. So it's much closer to that elemental fire because it is much more about digesting things that are very subtle, digesting emotions and thoughts and concepts, and digesting memes and mind viruses and all kinds of other things, information, all kinds of things that have been abstracted from physical reality, all kinds of things that have been conceptualized.
So there's so many things that we're taking in all the time. Are you basically saying that we have to be able to digest those things or find ways to navigate the world that help support our Bhuta Agni to help us know what we're supposed to be doing, for example, know our Dharma to help us to function? Can you say more about that?
Well, here we are as organisms. Here you and I are sitting here, and every second we are taking in approximately 11 million bits of information. 10 million for the eyes alone. However, our conscious minds can work with, can manipulate, can process 50 bits per second. That means there's a tremendous amount of material that is being processed by the organism that is beyond the conscious mind. How is it being processed? I mean, people like to think of consciousness as being some sort of thing, happily not so bad as it used to be, but some sort of thing that is separate from the physical body. But consciousness is very much tied up with the physical body because those other 10,999,950 bits of information are being processed by your physical organism. They're being processed by your subconscious and unconscious minds. And if they're being processed that way, your Jatra Agni is very much part of that processing experience. That's why so many neurotransmitters are being generated in your gut. I think something like 70% of the serotonin in your body is being generated in your gut. So your entire organism is trying to process everything that we're taking in through our senses and trying to make sense out of it. And the way that we're able to make sense out of it is by as we burn through, so now instead of just talking about the food we're burning through, now we're burning through the food of the sense organs, and that's all these sense impressions all around us. And that food is being digested by the Bhuta Agni.
Food, I'm using quotes.
Here are the air quotes. Food. That food is being digested by the Bhuta Agni. We have to digest it also, because there are only two things that every human being has to do every day. Occasionally you have other things you have to do. You have to pay taxes. Maybe you procreate periodically. But every day you have to eat and you have to avoid being eaten. In the past, finding food was not a joke. Nowadays we have food available, or food-like substances available 24 hours a day. And they're not predators, non-human predators wandering around in the street all the time. But plenty of predation is still occurring, because your life force, your prana, goes where your attention goes. And wherever your attention is grabbed by whatever it is grabbed by, that's where your life force is going to be drawn out. As we move through this world that we're moving into right now, we still have to be digesting what we take in and trying to decide what it is that we should be taking in to nourish ourselves with, and how we can best position ourselves so it is less likely that we're going to be consumed by something. That's what the Bhuta Agni is doing.
The reason I really wanted to talk to you was to focus on this Bhuta Agni, because it feels like, we understand there's a digestive process. It's, and maybe we learned about it in biology or something like that, but this understanding of the fact that we are being discerning about how we're taking in information so that we can actually digest what it is that we take in. I mean, that's helpful for spiritual practitioners. As a business owner, I think of business as sort of being like working with fire, because I'm making lots of decisions. There's a lot of learning happening. I have to be able to digest that stuff and then make those decisions about how I'm going to project that learning outward, or, include that learning in the way that I structure my business, for example. So can you just talk about what happens when or maybe how we digest Bhuta Agni better, and what happens when we aren't digesting it very well? How can we tell?
Well, before I answer that question, I'd like to point out that, like a business, like pretty much any kind of creative thing, and like a fire, if you've ever built a fire before, it takes some time to get the fire lit. But once it's lit, you don't have to keep getting it lit. What you do is you have to keep it alive. It's the same way with the business. The business, it has to get started. But then once it's started, you're not restarting it every day. You're keeping it moving. Maybe it's growing part of the time. Maybe it's dwindling part of the time. But there's a certain current of activity that has to be maintained in order for the continuity of the process, the business, whatever it might be, to be maintained. It's the same way in your organism. It's the same way externally in the fire. It's the same way that, when you start off life by just drinking milk, and then you move to other kind of food, and then maybe you move to digesting other things. But there's always a certain sweet spot that always will differ according to the time of year and environment you're in, the nature of the whether it's dry or wet or hot or cold or whatever. But there's always some sort of basic amount of and type of food that you require in order to keep going. It's the same thing in a business. It's the same thing in any kind of other thing that has a life of its own. So the Jatra Agni is doing this for your physical body, and the Bhuta Agni is doing this for the parts of you that are more conceptual. And that includes things like your personality. Now, when you were just born, you might have had a name, but that was unimportant to you. And you wouldn't have been able to even remember it until you were a certain number of years old. But as you start adding things in to your self-definition, certain parts of your self-definition are always going to remain there. certain parts, maybe you will be shifting your self-definition here and there according to the vagaries of whatever is going on in your external life. But there's always going to be a part of you that you identify as being you. You may like that part, you may not like that part, but there's a certain continuity of you-ness that is manifested by the Bhuta Agni. It's created by the Bhuta Agni, and the Bhuta Agni is doing its best to keep it in that zone, keep it in that sweet spot where it is going to continue self-manifesting up to the point where you fall apart. So the Bhuta Agni, just like building a fire externally and just like keeping your Jatra Agni working well, it has to have the right fuel. It has to have it at the right moment. It has to have not too much and not too little. And it has to have some period where it's being fed and some period where it's not being fed. Obviously, the details are slightly different than it is for the external fire or it is for the Jatra Agni. But for the Bhuta Agni, it's being fed by all of the different sense impressions we get. It's being fed by all the different ideas you have, the different emotions you have, the songs you hear, the mantras you repeat. All of these things are inputs, and they all have to, the Bhuta Agni is going to act on all of them. And the Bhuta Agni is going to determine whether they are things that work together to enhance your self-integration, to enhance your ability to do things in the world, or whether it's going to cause you to develop some kind of mental indigestion, which is what happens physically when you eat too much or you don't eat enough, or you eat a pound of lard in the middle of the night, and then indigestion occurs, and indigested material sometimes gets absorbed, and it turns into what we call ama, which literally means undigested. And then it gets stuck in your tissues, and then things won't circulate, and then you're in a sad condition. And this happens in your mind also. Things can get into your mind that you can't digest. And if you can't either let go of those things or work through them in some way or apply the Bhuta Agni to them so they're going to be appropriately digested, then it's going to generate some kind of pathology in you.
So it's interesting because, for me, I notice when I lack clarity in my thoughts, or when I've taken in too much information, but I can't use that information, I start to notice, or if I have decision fatigue, for example, it's like I need to slow down and kind of reintegrate and strengthen my Bhuta Agni in some way so that I can have more clarity. Really, clarity is like a key point for me. Does that resonate for you when we're talking about how does it actually physically show up when you're not digesting things properly through your mind?
I would say that clarity is probably a good symptom to monitor. Some people have estimated that we only have a total of about 1 hour of actual decision-making capability per day. If you're trying to make decisions all day long that are really noteworthy, serious, and extremely important decisions, that's going to be very difficult. This situation is being compounded by the fact that there is way too much information that is being provided nowadays. In the past, it was not easy, and those of us who ancient remember what it was like when you had to first go to the encyclopedia, and if maybe it wasn't in there, you had to pray that it was in your library, and if it was not there, then you had to pray that somehow 6 weeks after you sent in a request on the interlibrary loan, maybe a book that would give you some kind of perception would come your way. It's all changed.
Now we can get anything in just a moment, but there's not a lot of mental digestion. So maybe you can talk about tips for getting better with your mental digestion. How can we improve that in light of the fact that we can have information at the tip of our fingertips and basically can look up anything we need, but to really learn, to really integrate, to be able to implement information that we get? What would be your suggestion?
I think the number one most important thing that we need to do is the number one most important thing we need to do for our physical digestion also, which is do not eat too much. That means make it a point to be very selective about what you take in, and only take in a certain amount of whatever it is you want to take in. Now, that doesn't mean ignore everything, but that does mean do not let yourself get caught up in some sort of I mean, they call it a rabbit hole. It's probably more like some sort of burrow that takes you deeper and deeper into some kind of place that you're being completely obscure. The rest of reality is being obscured. So it's good to know what's going on in the rest of the world. It's not good to pay too much attention to it. It's very good to know what's going on in your environment, your immediate environment. But because we have access to all this information all the time, we don't need to feel like it needs to be presented to, or we need to be accessing all the time. We can access it very selectively. It is very important to not become so dependent on the dopamine hit that we get from whatever it is we're checking, whether it's the media or whatever it might be, whatever thing it is that we're paying the most attention to, that we're always trying to get some sort of response from. It's very important not to be doing that all the time. It's like any other kind of addiction. You have to look at what it is that you are finding yourself becoming dependent on and stop being dependent on it. And that's why it's so important for people to be paying an adequate amount of attention to their actual physical reality, making sure they're exercising properly, making sure that when they're eating, they're actually eating and not simply shoveling things in their mouths while they're focusing on whatever the next thing is that they wanted to focus on. And how important it is, especially nowadays, to be determining what it is in a particular day that needs to get done, if necessary, and this is certainly what I like to do, dividing it up into discrete pieces and doing one little discrete piece at a time, making sure it gets done well, maybe sitting with that a little bit to find out how that little discrete piece is digesting, and then moving on to the next discrete piece. Definitely, there is no such thing as multitasking. The human organism does not work that way. At the most, you can be shifting your focus repeatedly from one thing to another. That in itself is exhausting to your organism. So that's not the kind of thing that you want to do, except in very specific circumstances where it is the thing that is appropriate. But definitely working more slowly is going to, especially nowadays, make it feasible for you to get more things done. So there is really a concept nowadays that, and certainly life is a lot faster than it used to be. But the very fact that it's faster than it used to be means that in order for us to compensate for that, we have to slow down. You have to make sure you're breathing slowly. You have to make sure you're thinking slowly. Because if you think fast, the faster you think, the more vata is going to get aggravated, and the less coherent your ability to perceive, which means to digest what's going on, is going to be working. Your Bhuta Agni is like any other kind of fire. If you have a fire down here and you start blowing on it irregularly, like you have a blower and you come out from a number of different directions, the fire is not going to appreciate that.
It probably start a bigger fire somewhere else.
Either it will start a bigger fire or this one will get all disorganized and start to go out. So it's really essential that, especially nowadays, you be focusing on your thinking, on your breathing, that it should be regular, it should be deep, it should be slow. And make sure that you don't bite off more than you can chew. Make sure that you know how much you can do, and you do that much.
Would you also say it's good to come into yourself and kind of quiet your mind on a regular basis so that you can actually hear your intuition? And I was going to also ask you how this relates to Dharma. How do we figure out what it is that we're supposed to be doing. But on some level, we have to have the space, right, to be able to tap into that.
Dharma is a big word, no doubt, but ultimately it comes down to your Dharma is the path that you personally, you are the only you. There's only going to be one of you. There's only going to be one of me. It's a unique situation and a unique opportunity to get something done. What needs to be done is, number one, what you're responsible for. You may be responsible for a family member. You may be responsible for maintaining the continuity of some kind of knowledge tradition. You may be responsible for taking care of a garden. Who knows what you may be responsible for, but you need to and try to find out what that is. And you can be sure that whatever it is that your Dharma is something that, number one, the environment is going to encourage you to move in the direction of. And number two, it's something that you will, provided that you can develop a relationship with your life force, with your own prana, you will be able to feel in your gut that you are moving in the right direction, because this is where the prana is. This is where the prana came into your organism first, when you were in the womb. So it's the part of your organism that is most closely or most anciently connected to prana. And it's the place where the fire element is located in the body. And it's the place, by virtue of that, where the intuition and your ability to actually see, not just connect to the photons that are converting into electrical impulses, but actually to get a picture of what is going on in reality. Not just this external physical picture, but the real picture that is a tiny, tiny fragment of what the rishis were able to see. That word rishi or darshanat. A rishi is someone who can see reality, but they see it much more differently than you and I do, because we're just looking at the external reality of it, and they're seeing the totality, internal, external, on the boundary, in all kinds of different worlds, all at one time, and they are aligning themselves with the current of prana that is facilitating all these things happening. And by that alignment, they're encouraging things to move into greater and greater degrees of alignment. Each of us can do that sort of thing in a much more tiny amount, naturally, since we're far less developed than these rishis were. We can do that. We can come into an alignment with the prana. We can come into an alignment to some degree with the environment. That alignment is not static. It's dynamic, just like the fire is dynamic. We'll always have to be adjusting ourselves, which is why we have to meditate every day and exercise every day and regularly during the day bring ourselves into some kind of active equilibrium with the prana. And as you do that, as you put yourself into that zone, automatically the prana will encourage you to remain in that kind of alignment. And then it may take a while, but eventually you'll find yourself automatically being in that space of relative alignment. And you will find that the things that need to get done will get done. You can also be sure that even if you lived for 1,000 years, there would be hundreds of millions of things that would never get done, even if you wanted to do them. So it is important to remember that you're going to die and you're not going to get everything done. And you should be cheerful about that.
Yeah. So having some clarity may come through working appropriately with your Bhuta Agni, so then you know what you're supposed to be doing. You can be more choiceful in the way that you're moving forward in the world.
Yes. There's so many possibilities nowadays. So it usually, and some people are, our mutual friend Dhruva, for example, I remember he was a viola player, and I remember asking him once, how did you become a viola player? And he looked at me and said, well, it was obvious. So for some people, it's just obvious what they need to do. And it may not be totally obvious for you, but if you allow yourself to allow your mind to become calmer, it is going to be easier to see what kind of direction you need to move in. Obviously, it should be in a direction that you have an affinity for and you have a talent for. But it's also going to be, influenced by the things that you have responsibilities for. So you have to kind of bring these things together. And if you want a good example of how complicated it can be to figure out what your Dharma is, feel free to read the Mahabharata. Because the Mahabharata, it's an entire story about how people are trying to figure out what they're supposed to do, and they're trying to do the right thing. And every time most of them are trying to do the right thing, they find out they're creating even more complications than they had expected. And this will happen. We're in a complicated world. So do not give up. Do not become frustrated. Do not lie on the floor and start kicking your feet up and down. Keep moving forward. Mistakes will be made. Deal with the mistakes. Try always to, as Vimalananda said, try always to make different mistakes. You're a human being. You will make mistakes. But at least don't keep making the same mistake all the time, because then it becomes a pattern. Then you get into a rut. Then the samskara is created. And then it's harder.
So I have another kind of related question, which is this idea of crimes against wisdom. So when you know what you're supposed to be doing, but you actually do something else. So where does that come in here? Like with Bhuta Agni, being able to discern essentially like what it is that you're supposed to be doing, and then actually to get yourself to do it.
The concept of crimes against wisdom, prajna parada, or prajna aparada. Aparada means a crime, and prajna, jna means wisdom. Prajna means wisdom in all directions. So prajna in this context, in the context of Ayurveda, means the wisdom of your organism. If you look at, and let's not talk about urban animals, but an animal that is out in its own environment, does it ever stand around anguishing over whether it should eat the chocolate cake or not? No, there is no chocolate cake, but the point is that it knows what it should be eating, and it knows when it should eat it. Dogs, if their stomachs are upset, they will go for the grass first before they go for something else. We are no longer as aligned with the natural world as we used to be. And this is why Ayurveda is in the form that it is right now. In the Vedic era, it was a shamanic medical system. But once people started to become urbanized, it had to become different, because people were disconnecting themselves more from the natural world, and they were coming into a world where they were dealing with human beings all the time. And that changes things. What happens is that it becomes more difficult when you're hanging around with humans all the time and not always out in the natural world. It becomes more difficult to hear the voice of the innate wisdom of your own organism, of your intuition. I like what Shandor used to call his intuition. He used to call it squeaky. And squeaky, my friend Shandor Ramete, the yoga teacher, and squeaky because it's a small, squeaky voice that is easy to ignore. And that's what the prajna is. The prajna is telling you, you may have this much of the chocolate cake, that will be the perfect amount. And your tongue and mind will be saying, I will have this much of the chocolate cake, that is the perfect amount. And your intuition, your prajna, is telling you that because it knows this much can be digested. This much will not be digested. So when you ignore what your organism is telling you, not what your tongue or your mind or whatever you heard from grandma or whatever it may be, if you are listening to that instead of listening to what your organism is telling you, then you're going to get potentially into some trouble. So that's in the physical organism, but that applies to the Bhuta Agni also. So when you're not your thinking mind, but when the facility, sometimes we call it buddhi, when your facility of discernment says, do not do this. Do not stay up until 4 a.m. chatting, because you have to get up at 5 a.m. and go to work. But you think, oh, but this is the only chance. Well, this is that. You make a bunch of excuses. And instead of listening to what your organism is telling you is the right thing to do, you take your tendencies and preferences that you have and you allow them to direct you in a particular direction. And then you move in the direction of being unwell. And the reason why there is prajnaparad is, according to Ayurveda, is upada. And upada literally means a secondary support, but usually it's translated as allurement. I am allured by the possibility of becoming more beautiful. So I'm going to take Botox and add some collagen to my lips and do a bunch of other things. And because I'm allured by that. I'm allured by the possibility of making lots of money fast. So I'm going to buy Dogecoin and manipulate it in the Cayman Islands. And then you get totally caught up in that. And allurement is what drags you into doing things. Your squeaky is saying, rethink, please. This is not, you're not moving in the right direction. But you cannot hear squeaky now because there is a cacophony. There is a loudspeaker inside your head saying, must go there, must have, need, want.
How do we amplify Squeaky's voice so that we actually hear it?
Well, I think the easier way to do that is to make sure the loudspeaker gets the wires cut so that you are no longer reinforcing all of the tendencies that are dragging you in the direction of being allured. And why it's called a secondary support or a secondary foundation is that the real foundation is you being centered in yourself, you being connected to your prana, you feeling exactly who you are at any one moment, and recognizing that you don't need that drug, or you don't need that stimulation, or you don't need that thing that you believe that you need in order to be somehow fulfilled. What you need is to be connected to yourself, and then it will become obvious what really you require, not what you want, but what you really require. And then automatically, as you align yourself, you will find those things coming in your way. My dear friend Rose had a guru who was a very eccentric character who was originally German, but lived much of his life in Sri Lanka. And he used to talk about the law of reverse effort. That is, the more that you try to go in the direction of something, the more often you'll find that thing receding away from you. And if instead you simply say, no, I don't need that at all, very often you will find the thing coming in your direction because it wants your attention.
It's so funny because my puppy, she's 2 now, but when she was really little, if I tried to get her to come or I tried to go towards her, she would run away. But if I turned and walked away, she would run right to me.
Exactly. This is the way that so much of the world works. The more you try to go in that direction, the more you're going to find that, number one, you're extending yourself away from your center. You're extending yourself away from where your prana is concentrated and focused. And the more you do that, the more vata is going to be aggravated. And the more vata is increased, the less you're actually going to be able to do things that are purposeful. And the more you bring yourself back in and acknowledge that here I am, and there are the number of things that an individual can desire is literally infinite. But what I should really be paying attention to is the fact that I could die at any one moment. Am I ready for that? So it is always a good idea to be ready at any moment to die, and therefore ready to enjoy life as much as possible.
In the meanwhile. Thank you, Dr. Svoboda, for your time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Cosmic Business Podcast. We hope it was inspiring for you. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave a review for us so other spirit-led entrepreneurs can find out about us. I want to thank Team Podcast for production support on this podcast, as well as the musicians of the music that we're listening to now, Alexis Georgopoulos and Jeffrey Cantu Ledesma from an album Fragments of a Season, which you can check out wherever you listen to music. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I look forward to connecting with you on a future episode.